In June of 2021, a man vanished into the vast Arizona desert under such a strange and bizarre set of circumstances that it continues to perplex and confuse both investigators and onlookers to this day.
He vanished in June, but his case is just now capturing headlines across the nation.
Someone tried to start the engine over 40 times.
June 23rd, leaving his work site in the desert of Buckeye, Arizona.
I myself have spent over a year looking into this case myself, and at this point, I'm still not sure what to make of it. Now, plenty of larger podcasts and YouTube channels have covered this case in full, and I will probably be repeating a lot of the things they say. But what I have for you today is not only the full police report, we will be going through page by page discussing this case, but I have also taken not one, but two separate trips to the location of this case, and I have never before seen footage that I don't think any other YouTuber has been able to provide up to this point. Now, if investigations into areas of high strangeness interest you, be sure to like the video and subscribe below, and be ready to hear the extremely bizarre story of the disappearance of Daniel Robinson. Now, the story of Daniel Robinson's disappearance begins on June 23rd, 2021, with the officer saying, quote, "On June 23rd, 2021, at approximately 19:04 hours, I was dispatched to a telephonic call for a service reference a missing person. I observed the call notes, which showed that the reporting party, David Robinson, lives in South Carolina, and he had not heard from his son, Daniel Robinson, since this morning when he went to a job site at Buckeye. I called Daniel's cell phone multiple times. The phone rang, but I received no answer. I then called Daniel's work, Matrix New World. I spoke with Georgia at the front desk and let her know about my investigation. Georgia was very concerned and said that she would be calling some supervisors and that they would be calling me. I then spoke with David by telephone. David said that his daughter had been to Daniel's apartment and that Daniel was not there, and neither was his vehicle, which was described as a blue Jeep Renegade. The officer then spoke with a man named Kevin, who was a supervisor with the company. Kevin informed the officer that Daniel had been with a man named Ken that morning on the job site who worked with a different company. The officer then says, quote, "Ken advised that Daniel arrived at the site around 9 that morning and that it was raining. Ken said that Daniel was saying things that did not make sense, like asking if Ken wanted to go rest, and then asked if he wanted to go to Phoenix to rest. Ken advised that Daniel was not making sense with the things he was saying and that he was talking about things that did not make sense. Ken said that Daniel was there for approximately 15 minutes and then he suddenly left. Ken then told police officers that around 1500 hours he was made aware that Daniel had not been located and had not responded to texts or calls from work or family. Ken said that the road to their site runs north/south, and that if you head south, it comes to a T intersection, and that if you turn east, you go to Sun Valley Parkway, where they had come from. Ken then said that you could see Daniel's tire marks and that they turned westbound, that the intersection which leads to an extremely large desert area. Now, the report for this day concludes with the police officer saying that him and another officer drove out to the location that Ken described and drove around for several hours in the dark, attempting to locate Daniel or his vehicle, with no success. And at the end of the day, on June 24th, 2021, the police officers have nothing more to report. The following morning, a second police officer gets involved on the case and begins that morning by getting in contact with David Robinson, Daniel's father. Now, the police report says, quote, "I asked David if he was aware of Daniel having any medical or mental health issues. David said he was not aware of Daniel having any medical or mental health issues. David stated that Daniel had been acting odd lately. I asked David if he can explain what he meant by this. David stated that within the last few weeks, Daniel had told him that he met a woman and that he was in love with her. At this point, the police officer wraps up the conversation with David and soon moves on to talking with Daniel's sister, Davisha. I asked Davisha if she had any knowledge of Daniel acting odd lately. Davisha then said once, Daniel came over once to her apartment and would just sit there for about 30 minutes and wouldn't say anything. She reported that she tried to talk to him, but he would just sit there and not respond. Davisha said he just walked out of the apartment after that. Now, at this point, the investigating officers note of several different instances of Daniel acting extremely odd in the weeks and days before his disappearance. And trust me, these only get stranger. The conversation between Davisha and the officer continues with them saying, quote, Davisha also mentioned that Daniel had been talking about meeting a woman recently and that he was in love with the woman. She said that Daniel told her that this woman told him about an audio podcast to listen to, and that upon listening to it, it changed the way he looked at life. Davisha said that Daniel told her the podcast showed him how to view things in the world in a positive energy and to avoid negative energy. Davisha said that he told her he was in love with this woman and ultimately made it sound as if they were in a relationship together. After finishing the phone call with her, the investigating officer then gets in contact with Kevin, who was Daniel's supervisor at work. The conversation between the investigating officer and Kevin goes as followed. Quote, Kevin advised me he was aware of Daniel missing from the job site and that he was one of Daniel's supervisors. Kevin said Daniel does in fact work for Matrix Global Water and that he had been an employee with them for about 1 year. Kevin said he was not with Daniel at the job site yesterday, but that a man named Kenneth was, and that Kenneth told him everything that happened. Now, after the phone call wraps up with Kevin, the officer then gets in contact with Kenneth, and Kenneth explains the extremely bizarre story of what exactly happened that day with Daniel on the job site. And to better explain this part of the story, here is me at the exact location that Daniel disappeared at, talking about what happened that day. So this right here behind me is the exact remote water pumping station that Daniel Robinson was last working at the morning he went missing. Almost immediately, Daniel's coworker notices something very strange about him. So as the two men are chit-chatting and working, Daniel would suddenly stop and he would zone out and just start staring out into the desert. He wouldn't be staring at anything particular, but he'd just be like zoned out, looking into the distance. And on top of this, Daniel's coworker reported that he started asking him some very strange questions. Daniel started to ask if he wanted to go with him and rest, or if he wanted to go back to Phoenix and rest. And Daniel's coworker had no idea what he meant by this, and it started to freak him out a little bit. So after about 20 to 25 minutes of this, a sudden storm cell rolled in above them, and it started to rain. And because of this, Daniel's coworker said he pulled his phone out and started to pull the weather app up because he wanted to see how long they'd be rained out. And while he's doing this, he suddenly notices that Daniel's no longer standing with him. So he starts to look around, see where Daniel went off to, and he notices Daniel's walking over to his vehicle. So Daniel's coworker watches in disbelief as Daniel walks over to his vehicle, he gets in, starts it up, and before doing anything else, Daniel looks back at the guy and just kind of waves at him, like he's waving goodbye. And then suddenly Daniel just starts driving away, driving down the road they both came off of, and Daniel's coworker watched in disbelief as Daniel just drove off into the desert until he could no longer see him. Now, Daniel's coworker didn't know what to think of this at the time, and he kept doing his work, hoping that Daniel would come back and they could just get on with their day. But Daniel never came back, and at some point, Daniel's coworker became very concerned, In fact, he ended up calling his supervisor and reporting the situation and saying that Daniel was nowhere to be found. And he ended up packing up his own tools into his truck, and he got in and he started driving the road himself to see if he could see where Daniel went off to. And because it had just rained, a lot of the tire tracks from all the other trucks out here had been kind of washed out and faded. And Daniel's vehicle was the only set of tire tracks leaving this location. So he followed the tire tracks up the road until it came to a fork in the road. At this fork, you could go one of two ways. If you went one way, it would take you down a road that would bring you back to the main highway, and from there you could go all the way back to Phoenix just fine. But if you go the other way, that road just leads you deeper into the desert, into lots more trails and roads and whatnot. To Daniel's coworker's surprise, Daniel had taken the way out into the desert, and he in fact followed those tracks as long as he could until they just faded into oblivion. So it was at this point that everyone started to realize that something was seriously wrong. And the question on everyone's mind is, where did Daniel go? After hearing that extremely bizarre story of what took place on the job site that day, the investigating officer's next focus was to get in contact with the Caitlyn woman. Now, they used the social media account provided by David and were able to put that information into their police database and locate a woman who seemed to fit the name and description. Now, using this newfound information, the police officers use the phone number they discovered through the database and give Caitlyn a call. She answers right away, and the police officers begin talking about Daniel. And the report says, quote, "I called Caitlyn and she answered the phone. I informed Caitlyn of who I was and advised her of the situation regarding Daniel going missing. I informed Caitlyn that she was not in trouble and that neither was Daniel. I told Caitlyn I was only calling to ask her some questions to see how she knew Daniel and if she knew any information that could assist in police locating him." Caitlyn then told the officer that she was very willing to discuss the situation, and she had last heard from Daniel the day before his disappearance on the 22nd of June via text message. Caitlyn explained that she and Daniel are not in a relationship and that she has only known him since June 12th of 2021. Caitlyn said that Daniel was the person who delivered their food that night. Caitlyn said Daniel was very nice and that she and her female friend asked Daniel if he wanted to hang out with them at that time. Caitlyn said that night that Daniel had a canopy which he had in his vehicle, which he left at her home accidentally. Caitlyn advised that a few days after that night, Daniel sent her a text message that he had accidentally left the canopy and asked her when it was okay for him to come get it. She said she sent a text message back to Daniel saying he could come by anytime to get it. By canopy, I'm assuming some sort of jacket or parka or sweatshirt of sorts, just for anyone who's confused by what that meant. Now, at this point, Daniel's behavior towards Caitlyn starts to get extremely bizarre, with the report saying, quote, Caitlyn advised Daniel sent her another text message saying he could come by right then or tomorrow afternoon. He sent her a text message asking for directions to her home. Caitlyn said she never responded back to Daniel as she was out of town at the time. She then said while she was out of town, she observed Daniel on her home security camera going up to the door, attempting to make contact, then leaving the area. Caitlyn said she felt that Daniel should have asked for permission to come over to her home before showing up there. Caitlyn then told me she also never provided Daniel with her address or directions to her home, so she said he either used the Instacart food order info to obtain her address or just remembered how to get there. So to put that last bit in more simple terms, is Daniel had been delivering for Instacart, gets invited into Caitlyn's home by her and her friend, and they hang out for a bit and things seem fine. He leaves, but he forgets his jacket, which happens, and is just trying to find a time when he can come back. Which all of that in itself is completely fine behavior, but it's very odd that he just shows up to her house unannounced and tries to not like break inside, but knocks on the door and tries to get her attention that way, which that in itself is kind of bizarre. Now, Caitlyn said to the officer that around 1500 hours on June 22nd, or the day before he vanished from the job site, that Daniel had responded to her and said that he would not talk to her anymore. And this was the last communication that she and Daniel had with each other. After this, she told the police officer that she could upload screenshots of the text messages and send them over to the officers. Now, within the police report, I have the exact text messages, and reading them won't do it justice. So I will just have a little segment here where I will have the exact text messages on screen so you, the viewer, can view them yourself. After wrapping up the bizarre conversation with Caitlyn, the investigating officer dispatched several units to Daniel's apartment complex, where they spent some time driving around looking for his blue Jeep Renegade, and also stopping by his apartment and knocking on the door and seeing if they could get a response. At this point, nobody answered the door, and peering through the windows, they couldn't see anything out of the ordinary that would give them reason to barge in. They didn't have any sort of warrants at this time, so there was not much else they could do there. At this point of the day, the investigating officers had wrapped up all their interviews and spent a little time trying to locate Daniel's vehicle through a system known as Uconnect, as well as use their services in which they're able to track the location of his cell phone. And at this point, neither of these attempts were successful. Before wrapping up their shift for the night, the investigating officer brings up the idea of flying a helicopter around the area to search for Daniel and his vehicle in the air. And that does happen the very next day on June 25th, 2021, but even with the aerial searches, they have no luck. And the following day, on June 25th, 2021, or I should say the same day as the helicopter, they do some more attempts with locating the vehicle with the Uconnect system, but they're having some weird issues with like the account getting set up and aren't really able to do anything. So several days into the investigation, outside of some very bizarre interviews, they have absolutely no leads and no idea where Daniel could be outside the area around the work site. The police report then skips to June 30th, 2021, with these next sections written by a detective who is now taking on the case. He starts out by reviewing what has been said by the other officers and their investigation so far into the case. He then makes contact with Kenneth and talks about what happened on the job site that day, as well as getting in contact with Daniel's father, David. David informs him at this point he is going to be making his way out to Arizona to assist with the search in any way he can. While discussing the case with Daniel's father, two new pieces of information come up, which I find interesting. Quote, Daniel's sister said that in May, Daniel took a spontaneous trip to San Francisco without telling anyone. While on his way, he contacted his other sister in Fremont for a place to stay for the night. This current situation is different because he had not been in contact with anyone for several days. I was also advised that Daniel's Instagram account appears to have had all its posts deleted a day or two before he went missing. At this point in the investigation, things look kind of grim for what was going on with Daniel at the time. He was displaying extremely creepy behavior towards the girl Caitlyn. He's deleting all his posts. New things are coming out saying he's gone on spontaneous trips before and just disappeared for a few days without telling anyone. And everybody who's talked to him the couple days leading up to his disappearance all of them say that his behavior was very off and he was acting strangely, but he just never dug in too deep and talked about it with anybody. At this point in the investigation, the trail went completely cold, and over the next few weeks, nothing interesting happened. That was all until July 19th, 2021, when a rancher driving around the nearby area managing his cattle managed to come across Daniel's blue Jeep Renegade flipped over off the side of the hill in the middle of the desert in extremely bizarre circumstances. Right here behind me, this is the exact location where Daniel's blue Jeep Renegade was discovered, roughly a month after his disappearance. Now, I have my own vehicle, my Ford Escape, up on the hillside there to kind of give you a sense of scale on how big and deep this ravine is. Where my car is also parked is where, according to the tire tracks, where Daniel drove straight up and then cut right and drove into the ravine, if that makes sense. A few interesting things to note about the scene that police discovered when they were let out here by the rancher is that, one, the windows in the vehicle, a majority of them were smashed out. And given that Arizona was getting a lot of rain during the month that vehicle was missing, the vehicle inside was flooded with water and all the contents in there were flooded, which also supports the timeline that his vehicle was out here for the whole month he was missing and that it wasn't dumped out here recently. The other super interesting thing about the vehicle is not the vehicle itself, but what was discovered inside of it. Inside the vehicle, they discovered all of Daniel's personal belongings. There were the car keys, his wallet, his phone, his backpack with his laptop, money, all of that were in there. But on top of that, they found that the work uniform he was wearing that day, his pants, shirt, boots, all of that, he had taken all of his clothes off and left them at the crash scene, meaning that wherever Daniel went out here, he had nothing on, which just adds to the bizarre nature of this case. Now, when police brought the vehicle back to their lab and they analyzed the crash computer, they made a few even more interesting discoveries. According to the crash computer on the Jeep, the vehicle had been going about 25 to 30 miles an hour at the time of the crash. And interestingly enough, it also reported that the gas pedal was pressed all the way down right before impact, which, as you can see where my car is now, going 30 miles an hour off that ledge into this valley would be a massive impact. Like, I'm surprised he wasn't injured and incapacitated and just found at the scene. One last interesting thing about this location I wanted to show you guys is, despite how remote it is, I have full bars on my phone. Let's see if you can focus in. But I have full 5G LTE bars out here, meaning that I would have no problem calling 911 and getting in contact with law enforcement from this location. And given the fact that Daniel's phone was found at the crash scene, and given the fact that his phone had been operating just fine, all morning. There is no reason why he wouldn't have been able to come up to where I'm standing right now, call 911 and get himself help and get himself out of this situation. And with that added on top of the fact that all of his clothes were found at the scene of the crash, just adds to the bizarre nature of this case and makes you think that whatever happened to Daniel out here is that he didn't want to be found and he wasn't planning on coming back. Now, there's a few things I wanted to discuss about the area that Daniel's vehicle was discovered. And none of this is talked about in the report, but this is all completely from my own investigation. First of all, the road condition where Daniel's vehicle was discovered varied a lot if you were driving it in terms of point A being where he was last seen to point B being where his vehicle was discovered. Now, I don't know how many of you in my audience have done much off-roading in, say, the Arizona, Nevada type desert, but there's usually a lot of desert roads just out there that you can drive around on, but a lot of them, or they can vary quite a bit in condition. Now, the first half of the journey, driving from point A to point B, was pretty solid road, not too rutted out, and wide enough that at times you could have like 2 lanes, so a vehicle going each way. And that was up until like the last quarter of it. Now, I'll play some clips of it because I got a lot of drone footage of this area. But to really enter the thick of it, where Daniel's vehicle was discovered, there was quite a big hill that you had to go up of. Now, that hill, I had a 2016 Ford Escape, and you'll see it in the drone footage, that it took several attempts to get up this hill, and you needed quite the running start. And it makes me kind of think about what made Daniel choose to go up it. And it also wasn't like an obvious route for someone to take. It was kind of hidden, and like without the exact GPS coordinates, I would not have found this area. But afterwards, after getting up that little hill, the road was a little rutted. It definitely wasn't like a main dirt road, but it was solid. It wasn't like loose sand, so my Ford Escape handled it quite well. But it was in the thick of it, and especially if you were an investigating officer at the time, it wouldn't be a super obvious place to look for a vehicle. If you're looking for someone on, say, like a ATV of some kind or like a UTV side-by-side, it would make more sense for it to be in this area. But for like a subcompact SUV type vehicle, it's hard for me to wrap my head around why he would drive up this specific, I'm not even going to call it a road. It was more like a 4-wheeler trail, to be honest. The other thing, which I think is important to note, and I don't remember if I got footage of it or not, is I use AT&T. And the whole time I was around the crash site, minus like at the bottom of the ravine, but up on both hills where there's like a little road or trail or whatever, I got perfect cell phone service, which isn't uncommon in the desert, especially if you're in kind of a flatter area that like there's no like mountains or hills or trees blocking service. So I had full bars the full time with no issue whatsoever. And even if he didn't use AT&T, most phone services will like let you connect to any towers in terms of like calling 911. Like if you call 911, it'll just connect to whatever tower. It doesn't restrict you via whatever service. And that kind of makes me come to the conclusion that he had a working cell phone, or if his cell phone worked, which I don't think his cell phone broke in the accident, if I remember everything right. So unless his cell phone was dead, which I don't think it was either. So let's just say under the assumption he had a working cell phone, that he would have had no problem getting service to call 911. Which really makes the whole situation of him being out there even more bizarre. After all of that, to this day, I'm recording this in August of 2025, there really hasn't been any other updates to this case. There's still, every now and then, foot searches of the area that Daniel disappeared, but no other evidence has been brought up that could be connected to the case. David Robinson, Daniel's father, still advocates for his case to this day and is currently making a run for Congress as a way to try to pass legislation or advocate for legislation that deals with these types of missing persons cases. And all of this leads us back to one simple question. What happened to Daniel? It's a very hard question to answer without a bunch of speculation. But what we do know from all of the evidence gathered and what we can get through this police report is that Daniel seemed to be going through some sort of mental health crisis. And I'm no expert in this stuff by any means. This is all my personal speculation. But just being that he's a young man, new city, doesn't know very many people. I mean, he has a couple friends at work. I mean, there's people he can talk to, but he seems to be in a very vulnerable and lonely spot. Although he didn't seem to want to bring up the issues going on in his life, is that he seemed to have a lot of people around him who seemed more than open to talk to him about what was on his mind in the days leading up to his disappearance. It wasn't a case where he was actually isolated and alone, although, like I said a minute ago, new city, new people, no one around. He seemed to have quite a few people he could have called and discussed this with. And although the interactions with Caitlyn were extremely bizarre and abnormal behavior, I don't want this video to be kind of like spitting in his face for his reputation, because I don't think he was like a creepy guy who meant harm and was just up to bad things. He just seemed like someone going through something and was in a vulnerable spot. And that kind of led him to do abnormal things, especially regarding, a girl he was interested in. I feel like as a man, we've all been in a spot where, kind of acted abnormally when we were having a crush on someone. And with that, that brings us to the conclusion of the story of the disappearance of Daniel Robinson. The answer to what had happened to him, I believe, is somewhere out there in that vast stretch of Arizona desert. And although I feel the chances of someone coming across him is very slim to none, I feel that this case will not be solved until he's found. If you made it this far into the video, I thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content.